Hello, everyone, and welcome to episode 41 of the Ask Historians podcast. So today we're going to be having Jasfss, my co-host, interviewing what was our original first guest on the podcast, making a triumphant return, I guess you could say. So we're going to be talking to Celebreth about the Roman military. Specifically, in this is going to be a two-parter, so this is part one of two. We're going to be looking at the Roman military during the Republic phase. So we're kind of going to be Jasfss and Celebreth will be tracing this evolution of it forward from the days of the kings of Rome and when it was just kind of a levy or a militia up into basically we're going to kind of leave off around the Second Punic War here. So we're going to go through, we're going to talk about social classes and, the equites and, how that reflected in the actual provisioning of troops and setup of the military. We're going to talk about, of course, the Romans' infamous really, lack of skill in sea battles, including the evolution of the corvus when we talk about maniples and the Samnite War, and also just cover the First and Second Punic Wars, as well as of course spending a great deal of time talking about Hannibal and how Rome just kept throwing everything they could at him and kept losing everything they had. So it's an interesting broad overview of this topic, kind of looking at it as Celebreth says in the beginning. To study the history of Rome, you have to study the military of Rome, and to study the military of Rome, you have to study the history of Rome. I'm paraphrasing a little bit, but that's the gist of it, so hope you enjoy.
Welcome to the Ask Historians podcast.
Welcome to the Ask Historians podcast. I am your host for today, Jasfss, otherwise known as Mike, and I have with me Celebreth, who is here to talk with us a little bit about the Roman Republic military and kind of the organization and origins, and give us a really good overview. So, hello, Celebreth.
Hi, how are you doing?
Good. So, why don't you give us a little info on what actually got you interested in this? Because you've done some podcasts before for the Ask Historians podcast, and they've been on Rome, and they've been on Roman politics and Julius Caesar, but what specifically got you interested in this military aspect?
Well, for one thing, you cannot study, you can, but it's difficult to study Rome without studying the military of Rome, because the history of Rome is tied so intrinsically to the military that they go hand in hand. I'm going to be discussing quite a bit of history today, as well as just the basic organization of the military over the course of 760 years or so. So it's not only it's my studies of Rome that have really just tied in with the military, it's the fact that the military ties in with the history. Not only that, but the Roman military has always fascinated me. It's, when I was young, it's the standard image of the legionary in his segmented armor with this big tower shield looking all noble. I know enough that isn't exactly accurate in this case, but it's an inspiring picture.
No, and many hours of playing Rome Total War and whatnot, right?
Oh, yes, absolutely.
Of course. So, to get us started out, the image, like you said, that we have of the Roman military is this kind of big shield and all this kind of armor plating and stuff. But the origins in the region come from, we think of like Greek warfare and hoplites. So do the Romans kind of start off on this foot, or how do they first develop? What is their starting point in their military?
Yeah, well, the origins of the Roman military, you have to really go back to the fabled kings of Rome. We don't know too much about these kings because, well, all the records were burned when the Gauls sacked Rome the first time. But, in our mytho-history, essentially mostly in Livy, we can glean a few small details. We know from archaeological evidence the Romans at this early stage were essentially hoplites. They fought in a phalanx, generally in relatively small numbers, because the Romans were just one city. Rome was a city, and the original legion. The word legion actually translates best to levy. It originally was about only 2,000 people, which is, if anyone knows anything regarding the military, it's a relatively small-scale engagement. These guys, they didn't really fight massive wars. They fought like little cattle rustling raids. One person would mess with their crops or their cattle or steal something, and they would go forth and go for revenge. Or the Romans would do that, and the other people would seek revenge against them. It was, lots of little wars, almost Greek style in their fighting.
So you say it's related to levies. So then it's not a permanent army at this point. These are drafted citizens for a time, or what is kind of the makeup of these forces in these phalanxes?
Yeah, they're essentially a militia. They were called up in the month of Mars, which we now call March, which was the springtime. It was, right at the perfect time for an army to be mustered up, because it was right after winter. The weather was starting to get good and it wasn't freezing cold, so you could really have an army. And they would muster up their armies, and the armies were the best divisions we have are supposedly founded by the sixth king of Rome, Servius Tullius, who's the fun part about a little bit of a tangent here, but the fun part about his name is the Servius, or the Servius, if you really want to look at the Latin, is it comes from the word slave, because he was supposedly the son of a slave or a slave himself. Livy likes, tossing in a little bit of gossip over there. But he reformed the Roman military system, and he divided classes up, the Roman people, the Roman society, into classes. And those classes were extraordinarily significant, not only to the military, but to the Roman people as a whole. I'll see if we can go ahead and post up a chart of these classes in the comments in the thread, just because if I read it out loud, no one would really remember it.
Okay, fantastic.
But essentially, it broke down into 5 different divisions. The first 3 divisions were your heavy infantry. They were expected to provide some sort of armor for themselves. They were supposed to provide a spear and possibly a sword. If they were wealthy enough to afford it, they could afford that little sidearm for if the enemy actually broke their spear line. Mm-hmm. If the 4th and 5th classes were the skirmishers, they were relatively poor, and they were only expected to really bring some javelins or slings and stones. And then you have some classes below even that, and those are the people we really know as the quote-unquote the plebeians, the faceless masses, or as the Romans called them, the capite cense, the head count, literally the head count.
So you have these drafts in, you said March, and you have this organization of them, but so how long are these people serving in there? Is it just like a seasonal? Are they like seasonal warriors and then, war's over for this season, let's go back to the fields? Or what is kind of their length of service? How does this work out?
Especially this time, it was just one season. There was the first war in which Rome spent more than just one season in the field. It caused a huge political turmoil, people fighting over, oh my gosh, they're spending the winter out there, they're freezing, they're dying because of cold, etc., etc. You can imagine. But the at least, especially originally, but it continued on, the tradition was, in March, they would muster up for battle, and they would head out. The women and children that they left behind would take care of their fields while they were gone, because Romans were essentially all farmers at this point in time. They were sedentary farmers. And when they returned, they would return before harvest, and they would come back, demobilized, really. And the menfolk would be back in time for harvest to prepare for the next year. They would harvest, they would plant, and prepare.
And these classes still carried over even into their civilian life. Like you said, it does kind of shape the whole Roman society. What you are in the war season is what you are in the peace seasons, right?
Precisely. Oh. These classes actually, interestingly enough, they were arranged for voting lines too. Depending on how wealthy you were, you were arranged by classes when you were voting in the Comitia Centuriata, which is one thing I talked about in my politics podcast.
Okay. So we've talked about the foot soldiers, and one thing that you always hear about Rome, especially later on, is kind of the equites, are these kind of cavalry forces. What were they fielding? Any cavalry at this time? I mean, obviously you had these large hoplite phalanxes, but was there any sort of presence, or was it just man on man battles that they were participating in?
They had some cavalry, and these are above even the top class. You had just a few centuries of cavalry, and they were the richest of the rich because, hey, they could afford a horse as well as all the armor that any other classes were expected to afford. And the only real description of them we have is that they were equipped in the Greek style. Now, our sources don't actually tell us what the Greek style is, but generally historians try to think a slightly Macedonian influence there, with the something similar to the Macedonian companion cavalry, with a helmet, relatively long spear, a shield, and a sidearm, a sword, a cavalry sword. But there were small numbers of them, and you've got to remember they were the wealthy Romans, the extremely wealthy. You can almost think of them, at least at this point, almost the noble class as the equites, because of that stage of wealth. And they were very confident, very full of themselves. They were incredible on the charge, apparently, and they had incredibly high morale. But the clear, obvious downside is they also had a very high opinion of themselves. And they really didn't like being assigned to menial tasks, or tasks they saw as below them. One of the most significant of these is scouting. And this mentality carries on throughout at least the Second Punic War, if not later, even when the equites were being phased out by the auxiliary cavalry. They were still really horrible at scouting.
What, you want to use the horses for scouting? That's ridiculous. No. No.
Send the peasants.
No, there's plenty of them. They'll get something. Right. So we've hit on these seasonal wars that they were fighting. Who are they fighting these wars against in these seasons, and when do things start to change, and when do we evolve out of this hoplite or into kind of more of a professional army? What are we looking at with this? It's obviously they don't just do skirmishes for their the entire history of Rome. When do we start seeing actual wars pick it up?
Right. The first time, again, as I mentioned earlier, the first time the Romans actually spent more than one season in the field was the Siege of Veii, which, according to Livy, take it or leave it, was 10 years. That's still part of Roman mytho-history, because we're not 100% sure exactly how long that took. But apparently it took 10 years for that siege to actually be completed, which isn't a terribly unrealistic number. I mean, they weren't that far away from Rome. It was a day or two march. It wasn't a big deal. Mm-hmm. They were all cities clustered around the same area. And if you look at a map of Italy, you can really see what I'm talking about, especially this stage in time. But that was the first time they really spent extra time outside the field, and their first big land grab. And they conquered Veii pretty thoroughly. They actually found a backdoor in to end the siege. It's a pretty interesting story, but I'll go ahead and skip on to your second part of your question. When the Romans evolved past this idea of a phalanx or hoplites, and I wouldn't exactly call them a professional army until very late in the Republic, but the hoplites changed during the very underreported wars that almost no one ever hears about. They're called the Samnite Wars, and the Samnites, remember how I mentioned the Romans were farmers, right? They were lowland farmers. They generally grain, cattle, etc. The Samnites were the herders, and they had their goats and other mountain animals, and their primary land was in the mountains. And Italy, as you might know from geography, is split right down the middle with mountains. There's an east side and there's a west side, and the Samnites had the mountains and essentially the east side of those mountains. And they got along pretty well with the Romans for a little while, and then the Romans started taking territory and expanding. And the more the Romans expanded, the less land there was for the Samnites to bring their herds down to graze.
Right.
And as I mentioned before, all these cattle rustling wars, this is what started the Samnite Wars, which were a massive series of wars that no one ever hears about. They lasted about 5 decades. Wow. 50 years straight war with, intermittent peace. But in the First Samnite War, the Romans were able to take over all that flat land because the hoplites, the phalanxes, are almost unstoppable on flat, level ground where they can just walk straight at an army. They don't get broken up. Phalanxes are great. But then the Samnites just retreated to the mountains and just started raiding Roman territory. And the Romans, they couldn't deal with this, with these phalanxes, who just kept getting beaten over and over and over again in the mountains because they kept getting shattered. They got broken up by the landscape, and then the Samnites would use their superior formations, which were very well adapted to these mountains, to destroy them. The Romans, one very big thing about the Romans is they were exceptional at adopting things that were better. They had extreme confidence in themselves, but they also understood that if they saw something better, they could take it, they could adapt it, and they could make it even better on their own Roman foundation. So this was the start of what we call the Manipular Legion, which is a... Sorry.
Oh, go ahead. So we have... You mentioned that this is a war that takes place over the span of 50 years, which is quite a long time, and previously we had said, well, there's this 10-year war that's kind of part of the mythos, but we've gone from a season of war to 50 years. And how does the recruitment formula kind of change during this? Do they say, well, are people really, really disgruntled at having to come back and, oh, we have to fight this war again for another season, or is this kind of phased out by then? How does this work?
Well, it was one of those things where it was still seasonal warfare. They were still being called out in March. They marched out for the summer, had their battles, and still came home in time for harvest. No big deal there. And they just kept going to war with the same people over and over again. You got to understand, one thing about the Romans is they were extremely, extremely well accustomed to war in general. They had this temple in Rome. And Temple of Janus, Janus, Janus. It was their quote unquote temple of war in a way, and they would open the doors when they were at war, and they would close them when they were at peace. And these doors were only closed once until Augustus, and that was during the reign of one of the kings of Rome.
So even though it's seasonal things, they're not like just saying, oh, this is wartime, this is peacetime. It's still, we're at war. We're just going back to tend to the farms during this.
Yeah, and during the winter, armies in the ancient world just did not fight. That was just a thing they did not do, is they didn't fight due to the obvious problems with logistics in winter. You've got snow on the ground, you've got extremely cold weather, people aren't equipped for that, so there's no way any of the armies can fight. So there's sort of a tacit truce there, where both sides stop fighting for a season, tend to their own stuff, and then go back to it.
Right. Okay, so you were talking about the manipular formations, or can you continue on about that? I'm sorry I cut you off there, but...
It's no problem. It's no problem at all. With the manipular legions, the Romans... They changed. They changed from this massive block of phalangites who would just march straight at the enemy into smaller blocks, which, hey, clearly works better. Each of these blocks was known as a maniple, and each maniple was composed of 2 sentries. You have 2 sentries of 60 men, 120 men per maniple. That number could be adjusted by the Senate if they saw a particularly large threat to the Republic. They could make it a larger legion and just put more men in each century. Or if, it wasn't that big of a deal, they'd put 60 men in the century. We have numbers for these legions ranging from about 4,800 men to 6,000 men. So you see a little bit of leeway there. And these maniples were the sentries really, were individually commanded by their own officers, called centurions. And these centurions were elected by the men they would be commanding. Not necessarily always the best choices of action, having the men vote for their own commanders, but it was the Roman way, because they voted for their own generals, supposedly the consuls. They could vote for their own officers, because these are free men, and free men vote for their own stuff. Either way. The Manipular Legion was, again, 2 maniples 2 sentries per maniple, and 10 maniples per line, and then 3 lines for the legion. The 3 lines, people might have heard of these lines, is organized into different, along class lines and age lines. Have the front line, It's not just one flat line of men, you've got to understand. It's one line of maniples, 10 maniples. It was composed of the hastati, or the young men who were vivacious and ready for a fight. These were your late teenagers, your early 20s. If any of you guys are in that age range, you probably know how hot-headed you can be sometimes, how rearing for action, how passionate you can be about some things. And
these were the guys with something to prove out there.
Yes,
in other words,
yes.
is what you're saying.
Exactly. They had everything to prove, not only to themselves, because they were confident in themselves, but to their families and to their family name. This was a huge deal in Rome, and bringing honor on your family was one of the greatest things you could ever aspire to. And keeping that family name as distinguished as possible was just something that every Roman did their damnedest, to uphold. And these men were indoctrinated into this, essentially, and told by their fathers over and over again how much of a glorious honor it was to be able to do this, and to be able to bring that honor to their family name. So these guys were incredibly passionate and hot-headed about their fighting. So they were in the first line. They volunteered for this. They weren't forced into these first lines. They were in the first lines because they were the hastati. And then you have the second line of maniples. And the second line of maniples was known as the principes, the greatest men. I'm trying to find a good translation. It's the first warriors, essentially. They were the strongest warriors of the Roman manipular legions. They were composed of men that the Romans saw as in their prime. So about mid to late 20s to mid 30s-ish. Say 25 to 35 if you want a really rough estimate. And these men, they were not only in their prime, they were older and slightly more experienced, but they were all veterans as well. They'd all been in the hastati, and they'd all been through that process. But they were experienced, and wisdom is great. Being in your prime is also great, and having a little bit more money to equip yourself better is even better than that.
So these were kind of the middle class of the soldiers, really. They had a little bit of money to their name, they had a little bit of experience, and they were content to sit back and kind of let the hastati prove themselves first, right?
Exactly. And they understood their place in the legion. Because the hastati, they would go in with the first wave of fighting, and they would try to break the enemy as best they could. Generally, they weren't able to do it all by themselves, but they put up one heck of a fight to try to do it. But then you have the principes as your second wave, essentially. And these men are still fresh, they're still ready to fight, and they can be assigned wherever the general needs them the most. So if, the left flank is flagging a little bit, he can assign a few maniples over there, specifically on that side, and a few more on the right side, to just sort of finish off the victory. It's essentially, think of a boxing match. You're in a boxing match with someone, just a big slogging match, and both of you are worn out, but suddenly some random boxer jumps in from the wing and just starts punching, and he's completely fresh. That's what these principes could do. And it was a really, really, really devastating combination. And honestly, these two together won most of the battles that Rome fought, just with that 1-2 punch style.
Right, okay.
And then you have your third line. They are basically your last resort, and they didn't often get into the fight as much. They were called the triarii, and the triarii were the older men of Rome. We have records of them being in their 60s. These are not young men, 40s to 60s kind of thing, and they're very, very well experienced in combat. And since there aren't as many of them because, well, they're older and things happen.
Right. These are the guys that are like the week away from retirement, and then they get called into their last battle. And
Roman men were only expected to serve 16 campaigns, and then they're scot-free to do whatever the heck they want. They could go in for more, but they were only expected to serve 16 seasons of campaigning. So these guys, they were basically at half strength compared to the other two lines. You had essentially 60 men per maniple on these triarii. And the triarii, they have almost a throwback feel to them. They had large shields and large spears. It's very similar to hoplites. They were heavily armored, and what they would do is they'd stay far back out of the battle, and they would be kneeling on one knee with their spear ready, essentially forming a hedge. And that sounds almost counterintuitive. You're keeping some of your men so far away from the fight. But that offered for the hostati, if they broke or if they ran, if they panicked in any way, it gave them a safe spot to regroup, reform, and let the older guys talk to the younger guys to calm them down, make sure everything was okay, and to get them back into the fight. It was a really brilliant idea. And essentially, it's like a mini fort right there. You've got, some of your older men, but some of your most experienced men, some of your most heavily equipped men, just waiting there in the wings calmly. Very, very, very
this isn't so bad. You should have seen what the Etruscans did to us. It was way worse back in my day. I had to go through. Yeah, this is nothing. You've got this, right?
Yeah, you got this. It's okay. It's okay to be scared. We were all terrified. I remember this one time when I was a boy, etc. But you've got these older guys, and it worked really well because there were oftentimes when the hostati would break, they would panic because maybe a general waited too long to commit the principes, or maybe they just saw so many of their friends dying, they just broke and ran. You never know what's going to break a person, and it's not a mark on the person. It's just the human psyche can only handle so much, and having that just reassuring presence there really, really, really helped. Them being committed to a fight was seen as a general basically tossing all his dice on the board and tossing all his money on the board and saying, "I'm all in." That's all he can do. That's his last shot. And they would essentially charge phalanx style and try to finish the fight.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Okay. So as we're talking about this, again, this is all kind of happening during this the Samnite War that's going on for 50 years, and so how does this war ultimately end? Like, what ends up happening? Do the Romans ultimately crush the Samnites, or how does this kind of conclude during this as they're evolving and getting better?
It's a decisive Roman victory, and it's mostly due to the evolution of their army, and they were able to take over essentially the entire central part of Italy. They had their Cisalpine Gaul on the one side. It's basically the area right under the Alps, and then you have your area on the bottom side. It's known as Magna Graecia, and that was Greater Greece, or Great Greece,
right.
And that's the sort of the ankle downward of the boot of Italy,
right?
If you want to look at it in those terms.
That's basically what the Calabrian region would be in today, and where around Naples is kind of.
Yeah.
Right. Okay. So we move on from the Samnite War, and then
we have another war, another one that some people have heard of it, maybe a little bit more than the Samnite Wars, but this is the first real outside push that the Romans find. It's the first real recorded encounter of the Romans fighting with an outside force, besides the Gauls coming in and burning Rome down, which I don't count.
Just a side note, that's it. No, just a little footnote in history. Yeah, not a big deal.
No big deal. So the Romans essentially were doing their thing of, we took over all this territory. Well, let's go ahead and elbow all these little guys down here. There were a whole bunch of city-states in Magna Graecia. And one of them was called Tarentum. And Tarentum wasn't too happy with being elbowed, and they called for help from one of their allies, who had this military alliance agreement with them. And this ally was called Epirus, and their king was Pyrrhus of Epirus. And they called him over, and he said, "Okay, you know what? I've got no wars going on in Greece for now." I mean, the Greeks are... They're as fidgety as they come.
They do love their wars.
Oh my God! If you read a history of Greece or Macedon at this time, it makes current politics look very tame. If that helps, it's hilariously complex, and if you learn the Greek language, it makes so much more sense reading their history, because they just make. It's constant chaos. It's hilarious. They're like a whole bunch of children.
Athens, do you want to...
I can describe it.
Yeah.
if you put a whole bunch of 13-year-olds in a small room and gave them an Xbox with one controller, that's what Greek politics is like. I mean, you get one guy on top for a little while, but then a whole bunch of other guys gang up and kick him out, and then there's just this whole big brawl again. So for now, Epirus is the big dog in Greece, because Pyrrhus is one of the top generals in the world, or at least this region of the world at this time. Mm-hmm. He's renowned by everyone as essentially basically the best general in the region. They compare him to Alexander, saying he's third to Alexander, second to Alexander. And he musters up a massive army and goes to help out Tarentum because Rome's picking on the little guy. Let's kick these guys' asses. They're just, barbaroi over here. Barbarians. What the heck are they going to do? The Greeks had an exceptional record against the people they called barbaroi, people who don't speak Greek from foreign lands. And Pyrrhus invaded with about, I think, 60,000 men, phalangites, and he had cavalry, he had elephants. And these are creatures the Romans have never seen before. Their responses to the elephants were absolutely hilarious, but they eventually worked. And these wars were known as, or this war really, was known as the Pyrrhic War. And it was a really bloody war on both sides. And Pyrrhus was pretty shocked. The first time he saw a Roman camp, they would set up a camp at the end of every day. He said, these guys, they're not the barbarians we originally thought they were, because this is a pretty sophisticated camp,
Right. These were kind of the little forts that they were kind of setting up, right? These were kind of, or was this at the stage where they had kind of little temporary forts set up and things like that?
They set up a temporary fort every night. It was a four-sided fort, 4 doors to the fort. Everything was organized along, exacting lines. It's actually really incredible when you look at it because they had no modern technology, and they're setting everything up, perfect grids, you name it. The general's tent is always in the exact same place. Supply tent's always in the exact same place. Your hospital area, same exact place. Everything is lined up perfectly, so everyone knows exactly where everything is in the camp. It's really impressive, especially for a militia army. Wait, the Pyrrhic Wars. So this is where we get our term Pyrrhic victory from. If you mentioned Total War earlier, a lot of people playing that have probably seen that before, where you win victories, but you lose so much in that victory that it's basically just as good as a loss. That's what happened in the Pyrrhic Wars. If in the ancient world, it was basically expected if you won a battle, the casualties would be absurdly lopsided in your favor. 10-1 kind of thing. Mm-hmm. But
it was kind of an all or nothing. There weren't kind of like a half and half. It was just an overrun kind of thing, right?
Yeah, but in the Pyrrhic Wars, yeah. Well, because when one side broke, they would all run.
Right.
One man, one little bit goes down, they all go down.
Right.
And when they were running, you'd be able to kill all of them, or a good chunk of them as they ran away, and then loot their camp, etc. But the Romans, they were weird, okay? They didn't break as easily as all these other enemies that the Pyrrhus had fought. Mm-hmm. And their casualties were not as lopsided as he would like. He lost, 8,000 to 10,000 men a fight, which is absolutely absurd for a winning army. Mm-hmm. And after he won a couple of these victories against the Romans, he said, if I win one more victory, I'm going to be undone. I'm totally screwed. So the Romans, they lost a couple battles, but they were still raring to go for more, because that's the thing about Romans. They're like bobbleheads. You pop them back down, they'll come right back up. And Pyrrhus, he was trying to get involved in the Magna Graeca politics, essentially. So he went down to Sicily for a little bit because there was another power that was bullying more Greek city-states over there, and he wanted them on his side. Politics, again. I scratch your back, you scratch mine. That's
right. And especially in this kind of war, he's thinking, well, I better call in every ally that I can get at this point, correct?
Exactly. Well, the more people were on Pyrrhus' side, the more reinforcements he could get, the more supply depots he had, etc. He had a reputation he had to maintain. So he went off to Sicily, where this other power, known as Carthage, was bullying around some more city-states. And he got into it with Carthage, which sort of ended in more stalemate-esque fighting. He still won in Sicily, but nothing extremely brutal. Mm-hmm. And well, since he wasn't in Magna Graecia anymore, Rome started picking on Tarentum again. Because it was Tarentum's fault that they were here. So.
Did you expect us not to continue fighting?
Exactly. Which, of course, had forced Pyrrhus to come on back. And then the Romans engaged him one more time. Pyrrhus, with his relatively weakened army, against the Romans, who managed to kill off all of his elephants over time. I'll have to find some descriptions of the war equipment they used to try to kill these things. They got like carts and they put massive spinning balls of spikes on top and they filled them with archers who shot flaming arrows at these elephants, kind of thing. Like they made up the craziest things just to try to kill these monsters off.
Just whatever you can throw at them, basically. Especially if you're facing something you've never seen or faced before in Italy at that point, then might as well.
Funnily enough, those weird makeshift tank things, actually, they kind of worked out okay. They did push the elephants back, but then they got overrun by infantry and completely burned down. So, that was a small problem with that.
It was a bad time to be in the tanks when they were burning down, I'd imagine.
Yeah, you couldn't really... burning to death sort of sucks. Either way, the Romans defeated Pyrrhus eventually at the Battle of... Well, it was originally called Maleventum, or Bad Wind. And, of course, after the battle... they won, so therefore the town had to be renamed from Bad Wind to Beneventum. Good one.
Quite the switch.
It
did wonders for tourism at the time, I'm sure.
That just shows the power of, we won a battle here. Let's show off and make sure everyone knows we won a battle here. What's up, guys?
Right. Okay.
Yeah. Pyrrhus was chased out of Italy by this, and he was basically, screw it, I'm not going back. And he was pulled back into Greek wars because while he was over in Italy, the Greeks had decided to start throwing tomatoes at each other again, and he had to get involved in more Greek wars, where he was eventually killed by an old woman throwing a ceiling tile at him.
What a way to go.
Yep. One of the greatest generals of his day. That's
fantastic.
It's almost as the guy who got killed by a tortoise being dropped on his head. That was Aeschylus, I believe. Either way, that's irrelevant. Back to the tale. Anyway, so now Rome essentially controls Magna Graecia, and they controlled the entire boot of Greece except for, the Gauls and Cisalpine Gaul up north. And the Romans essentially go to war with them every year anyway, and they beat the crap out of them and demand more tribute, a little bit more land. It's a long, slow war, essentially. It's not... The Romans never really focused completely on it at this point.
It's kind of a grind for tribute, and it's just kind of a fundraising kind of thing. And
yeah, and the Romans, the consuls were okay with it, because, they made tons of money off of it, so why not? Mm-hmm. But the Romans, they weren't... The Cisalpine Gauls weren't a huge threat, per se. It was more the idea of the Gauls burned us down once, let's make sure they can never burn us down again. Kind of.
Right.
They kept up these wars, and eventually they would, push into Cisalpine Gaul and basically take over the entire area or subjugate it.
Right, that's kind of the standard story with barbarians, that did you wrong once, you don't exactly want them to form back up and get strong again.
Yep, that was that was the justification for a lot of things. Justifications could be a little bit of a stretch, but that's just Rome for you. Either way, now that Rome controlled the entire Italian peninsula, well, where else are they going to go, right? So they started getting involved in politics with other people. And this ally that had helped them in the Punic Wars, or not the Punic Wars, the Pyrrhic Wars, Carthage, they started, there was a little bit of a snafu over a city in Sicily. If I remember right, this city got taken over by mercenaries who the city had hired, and they didn't get paid on time, and they revolted and took over the city. Mm-hmm. And they called both Rome and Carthage to come help them out against these other city-states that were trying to beat the heck out of them because they were rebel mercenaries.
Right.
And both Rome and Carthage thought this was a grand idea, and both Rome and Carthage decided to come help. And neither one of them liked the idea of the other one helping.
I can't imagine there was a lot of cooperation on, oh, you're here too. Oh.
Nope, there was very little, especially because Carthage considered Sicily essentially its own province, sort of like Cisalpine Gaul was Rome's province, quote-unquote, that you go to war with all the time. Sicily was that province that Carthage went to war with all the time.
Only we're supposed to burn this place down, essentially.
Yes. And the major city here was Syracuse. And Syracuse and Carthage, they couldn't stand each other. So they were constantly warring with each other, trying to establish dominance over this island. Which, it seems a little bit ridiculous in hindsight, but Sicily was one of the greatest islands of the Mediterranean. It was in the perfect spot for trade. And trade has always been, a focus of war.
Right. That's been a big thing in the Mediterranean islands, like Sicily and Malta too. Would be very, very contested territories. Correct.
Absolutely. And the issue is Sicily was right on that trade spot, and right between Carthage and the Italian peninsula, and it was just right there. It was the perfect supply depot. I mean, it took a few days for you to actually sail around Sicily, and that was with a light little merchant ship that was super fast. Thucydides actually describes it. I think he said it was about a week. I'm not sure. I'm going to have to double check that. Okay. But he describes it. I mean, Sicily's not a very small island, and there are a whole bunch of little ports along it, which is the reason there are so many little cities dotted all around the edges of it. Because the Greeks thought, oh, here's a good spot for a supply depot. Boom, city, what's up, colony. Yeah, the Greeks, they settled quite a bit. It's actually pretty impressive if you look at a map. But you have Sicily, which was this grand supply depot, if you really want to dumb it down that much. So the Romans, they saw this huge supply depot, and of course, they're Roman, so they see opportunity. And Syracuse kind of likes Rome, because Rome is sort of not looking at Carthage too happily right now, despite the fact that Rome and Carthage had basically just been allies against Pyrrhus. So with the snafu, it sparked an all-out war, which it was one of the greatest wars Rome had ever faced until this time, mostly because Rome, at the start of this First Punic War, they didn't even have a navy. They didn't need one. They were just fighting on the Italian mainland, and the one time they tried a navy before, it had basically flopped. So
when they were fighting on the mainland, obviously they wouldn't need a big sea navy, but did they have any kind of like river warfare or things? Is that what you're talking about? What they were doing at that time? What was their scale beforehand, before this?
They had tried one naval battle before this, and they'd lost horribly. So they didn't even bother to rebuild the navy, and they just fought on land from then on. Okay. So that was essentially the extent of the Roman navy until the First Punic War.
One and done. They tried it out, they didn't really like it, and then they moved on to what worked.
Exactly. They were figured, we don't ever need a navy anyway. What are we going to use it for? Nothing. Exactly. Okay, so the First Punic War is the first time you really see Rome with a navy. And that's, interestingly enough, Carthage's own fault. Because, well, let's start at the beginning. Sicily, it's an island. It's very, very, very close to the Italian mainland, but it's still an island. The Romans were able to get really lucky early on in the war, and they were able to sneak a pretty large-scale army over to Sicily. And this army was able to essentially fight in Sicily for the next very, very long time, and essentially crushed most of the Carthaginian opposition. Carthaginians, they used, what most powers used in this time were mercenary armies. And the mercenary armies, you hear the word mercenary, you think disorganized, rabble, etc. They were legitimate armies. They weren't just, the trash you can find on the street kind of armies. They were pretty solid men. The only issue is they had to be commanded by Carthaginians, who weren't necessarily the best generals. And, Sicily, the land war there was not all that favorable for Carthage. Okay, so the land war in Sicily was, it's one of the more underreported wars in history, just because it was sort of similar to the Samnite Wars. It was a long, slogging war, and not very much got done. but there was also a fascinating siege, and you see so much interesting technology deployed there. You see a lot of Greek technology on the Roman side, and they're besieging a Carthaginian city on the far west of Sicily, on the far west corner of Sicily, really. And it was... I'm going to make another video game reference for some of our listeners here. You see the city, I can't remember the name for the life of me, on the Total War map. And it's just, this little town, dinky town, whatever. But in reality, the city was a seriously heavily fortified city, 20-foot walls, a moat, the whole 9 yards, towers every 30 feet or so. This was a serious city. And one thing that Hollywood loves to teach us, of course, because Hollywood is wonderful for historical accuracy, is that catapults can knock down a wall if they shoot at it long enough, which is completely made up. Catapults, they weren't really... You didn't knock down a wall with a catapult. You killed people who were inside the city with a catapult. You had other methods for knocking down walls, and these were all employed. And that's why it's such a cool siege to watch, is because a lot of this stuff you see continuing on into, the Middle Ages, etc.
Mm-hmm.
Where you have tunneling, you have them trying to throw diseases in, you have blockades, you have catapults and, fire arrows, etc., etc., etc.
Right.
But you also have, battering rams. They attempted to build ramps back and forth over the course of years and years of warfare. It's so cool to see all this back and forth sieging, where we have really good records of it.
They were basically just trying any way they could to breach these walls, right? They were throwing any kind of method they could. These are absolutely huge.
Yeah, and this was Carthage's main foothold in Sicily, so they weren't going to give it up. So this continued over the course of essentially the entire war. The Carthaginians trying to relieve the siege, and the Romans tenaciously holding on to the siege. It's so cool, but I'm getting ahead of myself. The main aspect of the war, the First Punic War, was the naval war. And that's where you see the real evolution of naval combat in this time period. Because the Romans, again, had no experience with naval war.
Mm-hmm.
And they knew Carthage's main strength was naval warfare. So they needed to actually meet Carthage on their own terms, somehow, and eke out an advantage.
Right.
So... Remember how I mentioned with the Romans and the Samnites? They see a good thing, they take it, they make it better.
Mm-hmm.
They found a Carthaginian ship washed up on the shore. We're not quite sure how it washed up or why it washed up, but they found a Carthaginian ship washed up on the shore, which was essentially one of the greatest gifts the Romans could have ever had. Because these ships, we hear, all about, the automobile industry. That was the first time mass production was introduced. No. This was the first time mass production was introduced in the ancient world, because the Romans were able to dissect this ship and reverse engineer it because it had been mass produced. And these ships, they had a whole bunch of logs, or a whole bunch of planks, essentially, that were all labeled with exactly where they should go and how they should fit together. The same things you see in IKEA furniture.
Right. It was an IKEA ship that just kind of washed up on their shores, and they decided, okay.
And this is why Carthage was able to have such a large fleet, is because they were able to mass produce them, essentially. And, they were expensive, but they were still able to mass produce them.
Right,
so the Romans were like, hey, cool, this is easy to put together. Let's make a whole bunch of them.
And we have all the plans for it, so what could be easier?
Exactly. And one of the things the Romans always excelled at was engineering. Reverse engineering, especially something that's labeled and mass produced like that.
Mm-hmm.
That's no problem. Go right ahead with that. And the good news, though, is, good news. Depends on perspective. The Romans were able to make a fleet from this. And their first fleet, it was a proud fleet, and it sailed into a harbor after jockeying for position a little bit with the Carthaginian fleet of the city they'd heard was going to be turning traitor to them. This was really, really, really common in the ancient world. Cities, they were playing politics and jockeying for position. They were like, oh, hey, we're going to let you take over our city now, Rome. Please just let us be your friend.
Right. Just kind of playing politics the whole time, and then Roman fleets show up and kind of ensure that, maybe.
Yeah, well, I mean, and, protection from the Romans in exchange for the city being an auxiliary force kind of thing.
Mm-hmm.
Or the city providing some sort of grain supply, etc.
Mm-hmm.
Or provide, it was a two-sided coin. Both sides would help each other out a little bit.
Mm-hmm.
So the Roman commander thought this was a pretty legitimate thing. The city's turn traitor all the time. Let's go ahead and secure our loyalties over here in this city. The problem was, this was a foil attempt kind of thing. It was, the Carthaginians they basically planted that traitor attempt, and the commander, who was known as Scipio, sailed into the harbor with his entire fleet and to impress the city. Well, the Carthaginian fleet came up right behind him and walled him into the harbor. So he was essentially screwed. So him and all his men promptly disembarked their ships and got the hell out of Dodge, leaving all those ships to be captured by the Carthaginians. Who, well, they captured them because, why not?
Well, these look familiar. So, so you mentioned Scipio, and he's the figure that's in charge of these ships. So how do the Romans select him as the leader of this new navy that they have, and this kind of flagship navy that they're putting out there? What are his kind of qualifications for this?
He was elected. Essentially, that's how you commanded a Roman army.
So it was a political move by him to say, "Oh, well, I'd be a pretty good guy for this." Basically,
and due to his incredibly poor performance with the Rome's First Navy, he was assigned a sort of unique cognomen, which is sort of a nickname for the Romans, which was also sort of a last name identifier. It's pretty interesting, but that's a completely different topic. He was assigned the cognomen of Asina, which we actually have a user named after him, Scipio Asina. And the word Asina essentially translates to female ass. Yeah. The Romans didn't pull punches with their nicknames, and this was no exception.
It's hard to instill fear in enemy armies with a name like that. I'm sure he did not live that down for quite a while.
Well, ever. That was his name for the rest of his life. Interestingly enough, he was still able to secure a political office later in his life. I think he was a praetor again, but he had to live with being known as the ass for the rest of his life. So everyone knew exactly who he was. Just, in case. By the way, the Romans, they sort of brushed that off, and they built another fleet. And this one, they equipped with a new weapon that they had decided to develop, because the Romans, they weren't all that great at fighting ship to ship, and they knew this. They their crews were not very well trained compared to these Carthaginian crews who'd been on the sea their entire life, etc., etc. So they got these new weapons, and they called them the corvus, the crow. And the corvus would be in the front of the ship, and it was basically a big long gangplank with a spike in the bottom of it. And they'd swing that gangplank onto another ship. They'd essentially get up right next to them, swing the gangplank down, and then send their marines across. And the marines were essentially legionaries. Mm-hmm. And these ships, they were as crowded with legionaries as they could possibly be. And the legionaries, the Roman marines, were way better than the Carthaginians. Just absolutely on an exponential scale. If a ship got corvused, it would be destroyed.
So the Roman tactic was boarding with these really strong marines and kind of overpowering the crews. But what had been the Carthaginian tactics? As you mentioned that the Roman soldiers were just vastly overpowering them. Was that just a matter of experience, or was that just a matter of who the Carthaginians were putting on these ships and what their tactics with these ships were?
Well, for one thing, the Romans had more soldiers on their ships than the Carthaginians did, which really, I mean, there was a huge weight issue on ancient ships, and this eventually became a big issue for the Romans too. So you couldn't really, it was a delicate balance with how many rowers you had, how many men you had for fighting. Mm-hmm. But the Carthaginian balance had always been towards the rowers and always been towards ramming, because that was their key point in fighting, is to ram your opponent straight amidships, and they were very good at it.
Mm-hmm.
But the problem is, the Romans would just get up relatively near them, slam their gangplank down, which keeps the other ship from moving away because of those spikes that are digging straight into the deck. And you have all these Marines just flooding straight across and completely overpowering the Carthaginian fleet that defended them.
Right, okay.
And the thing is, the Romans were able to win a couple of massive victories with this tactic, which the Carthaginians never saw coming, because it was a new thing. And the issue there, it might be sort of obvious. It's the same thing that happened to the Japanese in World War II. They lost their experienced crews. They lost their experienced sailors. And you can rebuild fleets all you want. You can't rebuild that experience.
Mm-hmm.
So that became a really decisive issue later on. But of course, we're still in the early days. And relatively early days. And the Romans, well, they just won victories with their fleets, and they were sailing around the Mediterranean being like, yeah, what's up? We're the big power here now, even though we've never sailed before. And, oh, what are those dark clouds on the horizon? What does that mean? Yeah, the Romans had a perpetual problem with their entire fleet sinking. And when a fleet sank, you lost every man in that fleet.
Right.
So they lost the first fleet in a storm. That's at least 100,000 men.
So this is something that's occurring multiple times. The Romans are they're starting out, and you have this first fleet that gets kind of abandoned in this port, and now they're getting destroyed in storms, and
yeah, and then for that they rebuild another fleet, which wins a couple victories, but it also gets destroyed in a storm. Possibly because it's so overloaded with Marines and the Corvus that it's not actually able to balance itself as it should. So they were very, 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 very unstable and easily flipped over by strong winds. And after that second fleet, the Romans had lost a huge number of men and a huge, huge number of ships, which it's not that easily replaced. I mean, they're expensive, especially when you're talking hundreds and hundreds of ships. So, yeah.
And not only expensive in terms of labor, but I'm sure there was, lots of forestry and whatnot having to go on, and kind of scouring for all the lumber that they could, just all these materials, right? And
by the time they made this third fleet, the Roman state actually had to borrow money from all the wealthy people in Rome, and essentially said, hey, we really need a little bit of an injection here. If you guys could just give us just a little more, we can win this war. The Romans were exhausted by this war, monetarily, and they lost more men than they'd ever lost in a war before. And that was just because of the weather. Bad weather had killed more men than the Carthaginians ever had, and Rome had actually lost more men than Carthage in this war. It's strange, but that's just the way it was. So they were able to get up enough money from all the wealthy of the city to build one last fleet. And in this fleet, they actually abandoned the Corvus because it was killing all their men. And the problem was the Carthaginians weren't able to keep building their fleets as much as the Romans were. So they were able to, outmoney the Carthaginians, I guess you could say. Carthaginians had essentially lost the land war in Sicily as well. You had one general who was holding out, but he really wasn't even doing much. He was a bit of a guerrilla fighter, if you want to look at it honestly. His name was Hamilcar. Hamilcar Barca. And he would essentially, in hindsight, he was one of the Romans' worst enemies. But here, he was essentially the commander of a relatively small Carthaginian army that would engage in lightning attacks against Roman supply lines and Roman supply camps, but he wouldn't really accomplish anything significant. He would camp out on a mountain the entire war, essentially. And so the Carthaginians were basically being outspent here. The Romans and the Carthaginians were both basically crippled from this war, but the Carthaginians were the first ones to throw in the towel. They offered peace terms. Funnily enough, the Romans actually did try to invade North Africa at one point. They got utterly crushed essentially. But the Carthaginians only had won one naval victory in the entire course of the war, and Carthage's main strength, remember, was their navy. And them having only won one war was a pretty big knock on them, for one thing. For another thing, well, I mean, the Romans even explained their one loss away pretty well, because that's the loss a lot of people have heard about. It was the commander was disrespecting the gods. His sacred chickens weren't eating the food that was thrown in front of them. So, he was like, dude, what the heck? I don't care what the chickens have to say. We're going into battle. You know what? If the chickens don't want food, let's give them something to drink. So he throws all these sacred chickens overboard, which to the Romans, this is a big no-no. You do not disrespect the gods. You just don't. And that's, the big lesson to be learned from this one loss. You don't disrespect the gods if you want to actually win a war. So, that's the only reason they lost the battle, clearly, because they threw their sacred chickens overboard.
Absolutely.
Absolutely. No other explanation. So, the Romans are able to win. They sue for peace, and it's a pretty lopsided peace. The Carthaginians have to pay a relatively large tribute, and the Romans get control over Sicily originally, and then they revise the terms of their agreement so that they get Corsica and Sardinia as well, which is just basically a smack in the face of the Carthaginians because they can't do anything to stop the Romans from doing it. So the Romans, they basically, they're a bit of, they think very much of themselves with this victory. And the Carthaginians, well, they're not too happy with these terms, especially after the revision of these terms. So there's the one successful Carthaginian general. Well, there's a bit of an issue at home, because Carthage now doesn't have enough money to pay all the mercenaries that they were hiring to fight these wars for them. And Hamilcar, that general I was talking about earlier, he sends all these men back to get their pay, and there's no pay to be had. So immediately after the First Punic War, Carthage is embroiled in another war with these mercenaries. Interestingly enough, Rome actually helps Carthage out. It's this weird dynamic where it's like, oh, we're just in, a 20-year war, but it's nothing personal here. Mercenaries are a big problem. We get that. Let's give you a little bit of a hand here.
So that's really interesting, because as we went over this, the first conflict kind of started over this mercenary takeover of the city, and then it ends and they reconcile over this other mercenary revolt kind of. Yeah. Everything comes full circle, really.
It does. And it's one of the interesting things about relationships in the ancient world. They're very, very, very mercurial. They change sort of on a dime. It's not like you're in a war, but that doesn't mean you always have to hate each other kind of thing. It's like we've always been at war with Carthage. No, we've always been at peace with Carthage. Kind of 1984 double thing. But so we have this mercenary rebellion, and it's eventually put down after a few years. It's a pretty brutal war, and Carthage goes through a lot of hardship because of it. And the Barcids, remember Hamilcar, he takes his family and goes to Spain, and he has a few sons. And the Romans eventually called these sons the Lion's Brood, because Hamilcar was the lion, and these were his brood. And Hamilcar basically took over the Spanish peninsula completely. He dominated the entire region and basically asserted his control over it very, very, very thoroughly. And these Spanish silver mines essentially paid the entire Carthaginian tribute to Rome. So Carthage was pretty happy with this deal. Hamilcar was pretty happy with this deal. And, he was putting down some tribes over there, which didn't necessarily make him popular with the natives, but, they're native tribes. No one cares about them anyway, right? Right. So, skipping past a good bit of the politicking, because we're trying to talk Roman military history here.
Mm-hmm.
One of his sons dies off, the oldest son. Apparently he's assassinated. And one of the younger sons, named Hannibal Barca, takes over this army. And he's a favorite of the soldiers. He's been with them this entire time, fighting against these tribes, the whole 9 yards. And Hannibal has a huge chip on his shoulder against Rome. We're not quite sure why. According to legend, his father had incited this hatred within him for Rome. He took him to an altar and made him put his hand over a fire and swear with his life that he would do everything in his power to break Rome.
So in a world where we were just talking about there aren't exactly tons of rivalries or a lot of long-term hate, this was some very, very fostered hate is what you're saying.
Yes. Well, this is a Roman legend. So while it's sort of accepted because we don't have an alternate truth.
Oh, so of
it could
course.
be taken with a little bit of salt.
Fair enough. Okay.
So we've got this the story of this fierce hatred burning inside this general, and he decides he's going to take that hatred, he's going to stick it right to Rome. These guys who are forcing his people, just sort of into subjugation, who are just, they're tossing these terms of the treaty out because they're the stronger. He doesn't like that very much, so he takes his very, very seasoned army. Remember, this army's been fighting in Spain essentially since the end of that mercenary rebellion.
Right.
While they are mercenaries, quote unquote, they're basically Hannibal's personal army kind of mercenaries. They're not the kind of, I'll buy you for a couple years and have done with you. They stayed with Hannibal.
They're a long-term retainer of his.
Yes,
is what you're saying.
yes.
Okay.
He had different contingents of them. I mean, he had some Gauls fighting with him there, a huge contingent of Spanish swordsmen, and his core army of Libyans, who were they were the core of his army, essentially.
So what is it that kind of makes them gravitate towards him as a long-term arrangement as opposed to, I'll fight for you for a couple years or whatnot? What is the key factor in this? How does he get that going?
Well, first and foremost, he kept paying them. So he just kept paying them. They stayed with him. I mean, it's the same with any army, really. If you cut off the army's pay, they're not going to stay with you for very long. So he kept paying them, for one thing. And for another thing, Hannibal was an incredibly charismatic individual. He was able to inspire almost a scary amount of loyalty from the people who followed him. So that was one thing the Romans were very leery about, was that kind of extreme loyalty. Either way, Carthaginian and Roman relations started deteriorating a little bit, and it was very focused around Hannibal, who kept provoking them. And they'd set up, a border in Spain for where Hannibal could not cross, because the area beyond that is Roman allies, and we don't want to mess with Roman allies, right? Well, Hannibal decides he wants to mess with a Roman ally.
Here's your line, I'm towing it.
Yeah, basically. So he crosses this river and besieges the city called Tarentum, which is a very, very close Roman ally, and it's Rome's furthest ally to the west. And Rome's not very happy with this, because they're allies. I mean, come on. So Rome sends an embassy to Carthage. They're like, hey, what's going on here? Control your little general over here. What's he doing? Come on now. You don't want another war.
I thought we had an arrangement on this. You gotta.
I thought we had a deal. So the guy who's in charge of this embassy, he later becomes famous in the war. And his name, he doesn't have this cognomen yet, I don't believe. But he is known as Fabius Maximus. Later on in the war, he gains another cognomen. I'll see if I can get it right the first time. It's can't remember the Latin right. Other way, it's the Delayer.
I'm sure you would have done better with the Latin than I would have, so don't even worry about it.
It's Conquador or something. It's right in there. Either way, it's I can't remember it quite straight off. It's a beautiful name because it's got sort of a double-edged meaning, which the Romans love. They love that kind of wordplay, and the Latin language is really, really, really good with it.
Mm-hmm.
Either way, he is the leader of this delegation because he's the most senior, and he reaches inside his toga and says to this Carthaginian council of 104, he says, "In this fold of my toga, I have both war and peace. Which will you have? And they said, basically, whichever one you want. We don't care. They clearly weren't fond of Rome at this time. And so he drops his toga, drops the fold and says, so be it, we will have war. And the Carthaginians say, war it is then. And, the Romans hightail it out. And that was the start of this Punic War. And the Romans, they were raring to go. They were like, yeah, Carthage, we just kicked your tail a few years ago, like a decade ago. Our dads want us to kick your ass again. Let's do this. You guys have lots of money. We want it.
Mm-hmm.
So you have this very, very gung-ho mentality on the side of the Romans. And they channeled that into almost a ferocious wartime spirit. They get their armies ready to go back into Sicily. They get their armies ready to go to Spain because that's where Hannibal's at. And, they get ready to send these armies off. One starts heading to the south of Italy, and the other army, under another Scipio, heads to near Marseille in France. That's the modern name of the city. Or is it Marseille? I think it's Marseille. By the way, it's on the Mediterranean, this city in southern France. The problem is, when he gets there, Hannibal is already making his journey eastward. The Romans aren't quite sure where he's going with this army. They just know he's coming eastward. So after a little bit of jockeying with Scipio, Hannibal gives him the slip. And, his... I wish I could go into his journey a little bit more. It's epic on its own. He crosses multiple mountain ranges, multiple massive rivers, and he brings elephants with him.
Right. Like, this is the famous that? Hannibal March that everyone kind of thinks about, right?
Does that? He gets his elephants to go across rivers, like big rivers, for heaven's sake. And this is with enemies on the other side. It's a really epic journey. Either way, he gives Scipio the slip, and he goes to the Alps, where he begins his crossing. And he sends messengers to the far side to start stirring up the Gauls. Remember in Cisalpine Gaul, the Romans have been beating up on them for a while. He's like, hey guys, I'm coming over with an army. We're going to kick some Roman ass. Why don't you come help us out?
This might be a good time to really pay it back to the Romans, right?
Exactly. And, the Gauls are... they're sort of like, okay, maybe. We'll see. The Romans have been sort of kicking our asses. If we rise up and we fail, we're screwed. So they were sort of iffy about this at first. this Carthage just got its, just had to run away with its tail between its legs. How good are you going to be? And Hannibal's army, once he got off the Alps, it was a broken husk of an army. That's the best you can say about it. He lost almost exactly half his men. We're not sure how many elephants he lost. It probably was a decent number. He lost an incredible number of pack animals. His entire supply train was basically in shambles. It was the hardest men had survived. The core of his army had survived, which was basically what he needed the most. Mm-hmm. But he desperately needed some sort of reinforcement, some way to reinforce this. The Romans, of course, are sort of like, oh, what the hell? He just went across the Alps? Who does that? So Scipio, remember the guy who was in France? He hightailed it back, and he tried to throw together more forces to stop this. He left his army over in the Provincia, as the Romans called it, and he tried hightailing it back to Italy, raising some more troops, just throwing men together, really, to try to create enough men to stop this, because he's invading Italy. No one invades Italy. That's our place. So Hannibal faces off in a little skirmish against him, and Scipio is heavily wounded in this fight, and he has to withdraw. And he sees this, and he's like, no, this is a bad idea. This guy really knows what he's doing. We can't fight him. According to legend, his son, also named Publius Cornelius Scipio. The Romans really weren't creative. I think there are only 18 first names in Roman history. Over, 700 to 1,000 years of Roman history, there are 18 first names. Yeah.
It's It's a bit of a John Smith to the extreme.
Yes. So you see a lot of identical names, like Scipio Asina. He was Publius Cornelius Scipio Asina. And then you have Publius Cornelius Scipio, this guy who gets wounded, and his son, Publius Cornelius Scipio, who will later be known as Publius Cornelius Scipio Africanus.
So Scipio is retreating back to Italy, and he's trying to round up these troops, and Hannibal still has the core of his army left, but obviously he's maybe a little bit more low on numbers than he had anticipated, especially with the initial trek he had started. So is there kind of any attempts to reinforce him or send more troops along with him, or is he just stuck with these mercenaries that have been with him for a while?
For now, he's on his own because he's got no way of contacting the outside world at this point. He's in Cisalpine Gaul, and the Romans are trying to keep him there. So they're trying to scout around each other, jockeying for position, as ancient armies do. And there's this cavalry skirmish where Scipio, the older one that I was talking about, he gets wounded. And the Romans are essentially, they're forced to retreat from this. And Scipio says, okay, we really need to back off from Hannibal for now because we've got an army, but our army, it was just raised. It's not an experienced army. We need to train it because Hannibal's got a ton of hardened troops at his disposal. We need to back off from this. Mm-hmm. Of course, Rome getting beaten at all was already, a big lightning spark. And the Gauls were all like, oh, hello. So Hannibal was able to reinforce his army a little bit and rest his army, which was so essential to the battles that happened next.
Right.
Because the Romans had just elected a new consul who had headed up to take control of this army that Scipio had just raised. This new consul, he wanted glory for himself. He was like, I'm going to kick this tail of this Carthaginian army. We outnumber them. What could possibly go wrong? And that army is utterly demolished. So it's completely destroyed by Hannibal.
So we talked about in the First Punic War, you're saying that there was this navy that developed, and they kind of developed these naval tactics. And for the core of their army, though, was this the same army in the Second Punic War that had been fighting in the First Punic War, the same kind of organization that they had, or was
Yep.
it was pretty much just the exact same thing?
It was the same kind of land troops, and is your hastati, principes, and triari. Mm-hmm. And the problem was the Romans not only overestimated their own men, who had been winning battles all over the place. They destroyed the Carthaginians. They were, the best of the Roman world kind of thing, yada, yada. But they'd also forgotten that they were a militia army at the core. And with a militia army, it's whenever you throw it together, it's not that great. You need time to train your army, to get unit cohesion, to make it work together, to get the men to trust each other before it actually becomes a really strong army. And in these early stages of the Second Punic War, no Roman army actually had that cohesion, and none of the consuls were willing to spend the time to train their armies to get that unit cohesion. So you have these 3 early battles against Hannibal that are all incredibly massive. You have Trasimene and Cannae and Trebia, not in that order, clearly, but the Romans take incredibly massive losses because they get these levies, huge, outnumbering Hannibal sometimes by 3-1, but they're inexperienced and they've gotten, they're just thrown together. And every single time they've got this foreboding of, this is the guy that we can't beat.
Right. So there's kind of a psychological element, and even the Triari can't reroute these men or reform these men at the end of this. They're just kind of routing out, right?
And exactly. And oftentimes the consuls themselves, they weren't experienced with warfare as much as they could have been. And they wanted that glory because they were only in that position for a year. So they had 1 year to win as many battles as they could. To be that one person who was able to take Hannibal out, that was a huge prize that they all were sort of wanting. Mm-hmm. So this is where, remember that guy I mentioned earlier, Fabius Maximus? He comes in. And he becomes known as the Delayer. Actually starts becoming known as that before Kane, but especially after Kane. He advocates a strategy today we call Fabian tactics. I mean, the best way to describe it, guerrilla warfare. He didn't actually fight with Hannibal. He shadowed the army. Hannibal would offer battle. Fabius would be like, I feel like sleeping in today. We'll stay inside the camp. But if Hannibal would move, they would harass his supply lines, harass any stragglers, make sure he couldn't really forage, and just sort of whittle him down slowly. And this, it was an incredible exercise of discipline for the Romans, but it was also probably the best strategies the Romans could have followed, because Hannibal was isolated in Italy. He was slowly moving down south, and his strategy was to break these city-states away from Rome. Remember how I said in the ancient world, city-states often, defected to the side they thought was winning?
Mm-hmm.
His strategy was to get as many of these city-states to break away from Rome as he could. The problem was he really underestimated the ties they had with the Romans in general, because the Romans were they were able to tie these city-states to them with citizenship, with marriage, with political involvement, the whole 9 yards. And it was some really, really, really intricate stuff. And Hannibal wasn't actually he was able to move south into Magna Graecia, this region that was relatively new to Roman rule. They weren't too happy with it yet. He was able to break a few of them away from Rome. But then Rome ensured the other city-states wouldn't break away by having a second army go back behind Hannibal, and whenever he left one of those cities that had defected, they would utterly crush it in an almost excruciating manner, just to set an example for everyone else. And Hannibal, if he didn't rush back, that city was going to get completely destroyed. If he did rush back, he was going to lose all momentum. So he was stuck between a rock and a hard place here, and sort of being bounced around between these Roman armies, never able to actually engage them, but essentially being bottled up in the south part of Italy, which did get ravaged over the course of this war. But over the next, decade, he didn't accomplish anything.
He never really reached the heart of the Roman territory, just kind of those outer regions, right? Yeah.
He did actually try to besiege Rome once, but he was forced to retreat just because he had no logistics line, and Rome had some armies that were in perfect position to surround him if he tried. So he was never able to actually seriously besiege Rome. And honestly, even to this day, most historians don't even think he was trying to destroy Rome itself. He was trying to humiliate Rome in the same manner that Rome had humiliated Carthage.
Right. And so he's not getting a lot of reinforcements, and as he's kind of getting harassed, do a lot of these mercenaries that he's had with him start breaking off, or just kind of deciding that it's not worth it to follow him on this if they're getting beat up, and maybe the pay's not quite as worth it as we thought?
Shockingly, we actually don't have any reports of defections from Hannibal. We've got reports of defections to him, but none of defections away from him.
So his charisma really kind of held these troops together, even through all this kind of negative stuff that was happening towards him. Really bad.
Yeah, he was honestly an incredible general with this, and it's really impressive. But the Hannibal side of this war essentially had him bottled up. Remember that army that was left over in France that I was talking about? The one over in Provincia by Scipio?
Right.
That army was sent into Spain to try to defeat the Spanish province over there, to take away the Carthaginian source of silver and a huge source of strength, potentially for Hannibal, because those were the Barcids. That was his family that controlled it, and if any reinforcements came, it was probably going to be from there. So the Romans sent their armies over there, and those armies got absolutely destroyed by the Carthaginian armies that were there. And they got pushed back all the way back to this little area in Provincia. And then, remember Publius Cornelius Scipio, the young guy, he he was trying to play on his father's military status, and he got lucky, or he was just a very good politician when he was, very, very young. He was able to get himself elected consul and had himself appointed the commander of those legions over in Spain. So he brought them some reinforcements, a couple of extra legions, and then he spent the entire winter training them, just solid training, making sure there was cohesion, making sure they worked together, and making sure they were one solid unit that trusted him explicitly as their commander. And with that army, he was still outmanned at least 3-1 in Spain by the Carthaginians. The Carthaginians had 3 larger armies than Scipio's in Spain. And he desperately needed a victory, not only to show the people of Rome that he could win, but to show his army that they could win. So you've got this huge necessity for victory. And funnily enough, he had some interesting ways of motivating his troops. His primary way was to advertise that he was the son of a god. And his primary story for this is actually sort of similar to Alexander's, is that his father wasn't actually Publius Cornelius Scipio. It was Zeus, in the form of a snake, had slept with his mother while she was sleeping, and
which is not an incredibly, unbelievable story.
Yeah, of course not. I mean, this happened with Alexander. Of course it happened to me. And so he would sit in the very early mornings in the temple of Jupiter, and he would claim he was receiving visions from Jupiter, and he would receive visions in his dreams, and the whole 9 yards. So he decided his target was going to be a little bit unorthodox. He was going to assault and take the greatest Carthaginian stronghold in Spain, which of course was the least likely target for him to hit. So in some ways it was the best target. It was
it was the one they would never expect.
Exactly. It was a city they called Nova Carthago, which New Carthage, it means new city. Great name. It's sort of like the Potomac River. It means the river.
Right.
It's redundancies have always happened throughout time. But so you have New Carthage being besieged by Scipio. And he knows he needs to break it quickly, or else these other armies are going to come and relieve the siege, and he's going to have to run away with his tail between his legs, which isn't all that great of a prospect for this young general who's claimed that he's, the son of a god.
It's not exactly a good way to ascend in the Roman political order.
Exactly. So he befriends all these tribesmen that the Carthaginians have been warring with for the last who knows how long. And a fisherman tells him of these tides in the harbor. And they go down at a certain point on a certain day, and men can walk across the water. And one of the weaker walls of New Carthage was against the water, and it was slightly smaller than the other ones, and it wasn't actually defended. So Scipio went to his men and said, Poseidon revealed this thing to me, and he's going to be helping us out over here, okay?
Poseidon's the fisherman down by the docks. That's just what he forgot to leave out.
Exactly. So of course, he says to his men, at this particular time, on this particular day, Poseidon is going to lower the water and allow us to walk across it as if it were land. And then we will take the city from there. So, of course, he orders a massive frontal assault at the same time, which sounds really suicidal to the men who are doing it, unless they know the entire plan, or unless they really trust the commander, which is one of the reasons why I'm talking about this so much, is because the way he trained his men was so intrinsically valuable to them that he was able to take the city in a completely unorthodox fashion. His men successfully climbed the wall on the short end, and the massive frontal assault worked on that end too. So you actually have a fun little anecdote from Polybius here of how it almost sparks an internal conflict between the Navy and the Army over who got to the top of the wall first. And Scipio eventually settled it by saying, okay, you guys both did it at the same exact time. You both get an award here.
The participation award of the Roman Wars.
Well, whoever got to the top of the wall first got this very, very, very high award. And one guy from the Navy was claiming that he got there first. One guy from the Army was claiming he got there first. And each side was supporting the relative man. And they were about to get into a massive fight over it. But he was able to calm them down and assert discipline just that well. Just because they were well trained, and especially now, he was their commander. And his command was extended because of this victory. And he was able to, long story short, eventually take over all of Spain with this newly trained army that was, honestly, after the army was trained and well put together, it was one of the best armies in the ancient world. It was almost unbeatable.
So that winter training really set them apart from the regular levies that had just been pulled up and then thrown against onslaughts, right?
And had failed, yeah.
Right.
And he used the same method when he eventually invaded Africa and defeated Hannibal at the Battle of Zama, with the fact that he had a trained army and was able to face off against Hannibal with that very, very well-trained army.
So is this kind of training method adopted within the rest of Rome for people who are raising armies afterwards? They think, hey, that really worked out well, what he did. I might as well try doing that from now on instead of just taking this green army in. Do we have any kind of records of that, or is it just he's the main one and that's kind of what it is?
Interestingly enough, he's the main example. And this happens a couple of other times with his adopted son, Publius Cornelius Scipio Africanus Aemilianus Numantius, I believe? Numantius, because, yeah, he fought Numantius. Anyway, he had a lot of names. He also, during the Third Punic War, had to retrain the army because it was an undisciplined mess that was just completely failing at its projected goal. This happened in Macedonia, when during the Macedonian Wars, which are also glossed over for some strange reason in history books. They're so cool and so fascinating. But that's where you see, I mean, come on, that's where you see the Roman legion pitted against the Macedonian phalanx, and you get to actually see which one comes out on top and when and how it all worked. It's so cool. But
this isn't something that is adopted very widespread until it needs to. It's something that they think, oh, that was nice. Why don't we just go back to the green recruits again?
Yeah. Well, I mean, again, as I mentioned, these consuls, they were only in power for 1 year. And a 1 year term means you have to get out there, you have to win, and you have to go home in time to get your triumph. Most of them were thinking, I don't have time to train. I've got to go fight immediately, or as soon as possible, because there wasn't a guarantee that the enemy would accept a battle that was offered. Kind of thing. So they were very gung-ho about, I've got to do it now, when the better strategy, clearly, as Scipio pioneered, was to sit back, train, and then go. Because then you have a really, really, really good army, instead of some guys who are just like, he told me to stand here.
I just get paid to do this one thing. And
yeah, basically.
That's it.
And they didn't even get paid that much. It was their civic duty to fight for.
Right.
Yeah. But this was basically one of the big turning points of the Roman army, is when they start realizing that they lose unless they're trained. And you see this over the course of the next century, actually, when next 60 years, I'm going to go ahead and say, until the Third Punic War and the end of the Macedonian Wars, which both happened in 146 BCE. And over the course of that, from the end of the Second Punic War, you have Roman armies that just start declining in quality because they haven't had experience, and they're starting to rest back on their laurels, saying, you remember, oh, we're the best army in the world, you can't beat us, kind of thing. They get their tails kicked. And they get their tails kicked in Greece. They get their tails kicked by Carthage even in the Third Punic War, until a general comes in and trains them and asserts a relatively dominating role over the army, in which case they yet again become one of the best armies in the world, and something that's not to be trifled with. So you have this sort of cycle of armies getting better and armies getting worse.
Right.
And that sort of continues. And by the end of the Third Punic War and the end of the Macedonian Wars, the Roman army is nowhere near the quality it was during the Second Punic War. And after those wars, those are the last few major wars that Rome faces against an outside quote-unquote threat. And after that, Rome has dominated the entire Mediterranean. And these men who are fighting for Rome, they remember how they were originally there for just a season?
Mm-hmm.
They have to be there for more than that. And because they're garrisons at this point. So they have to stay there for, a decade.
So it's a more permanent army at this point. It's a more professional army as opposed to...
Yeah, they're becoming much more permanent and much more set, but there are problems with that. And I'm going to go ahead and go into that a little bit more in part 2, because that really leads into the first century and what went wrong there. Why so many armies just started popping up out of nowhere, and why they all started turning against Rome, which is another really, really cool story.
But that is unfortunately where we're going to leave off for this episode. In part 2, in 2 weeks, we're going to come back and continue on the Roman military and Roman history through a military perspective, looking all the way through the late Republic era up into the founding of of Augustus's imperial system. So we'll be talking about Julius Caesar and the triumvirates and Pompey the Great and also Mark Antony and everything, all the greatest hits that you're looking forward to, as well as going into a little bit more of the social and economic and really all the history that underpinned all of these conflicts that would come along, including kind of these social and personal conflicts. So I hope you'll come back in 2 weeks and enjoy that episode. If you would like, we are on iTunes, so you can rate and review us there, or through any other streaming service you might be using. If there's a way to rate us on that, feel free. As in the meantime, tell some friends, tell some family, so you have people to share this wonderful podcast with, and you can wax on about the Roman military and to anyone else you'd like to wax on about. Our YouTube page is filling up with our back catalog, and you can also find the most recent episodes on our SoundCloud page. All of those are going to be linked into the discussion post, where if you have any questions for myself or Jasfss about the podcast, or about questions for Celebreth about this topic, you can feel free to post them there. So, and if you come by a little late, don't worry. All those responses go straight to me, and I forward them over to our interviewer, or interviewee, I guess you could say. So don't be afraid to come late to the party. In the meantime, hope you enjoy. We'll see you in 2 weeks.
You've been listening to the Ask Historians podcast. For more history like this, visit us at reddit.com/r/AskHistorians and ask over 100 historians and enthusiasts anything you want to know in history. Find us on Twitter as @AskHistorians and subscribe to the show on iTunes. Or visit askhistorians.libsyn.com. Thank you very much for listening, and join us next time on the Ask Historians podcast.